My name is Thad Zolkowski. I'm the Associate Director of the Leon Levy Center for Biography here at CUNY Grad Center. And this center is funded by a generous grant from the Leon Levy Foundation and Shelby White. Each year we offer 4 residency fellowships of $72,000 per fellow. And this year our 4 fellows are Rebecca Donner, who's working on a biography of Nazi resistor Mildred Harnack, who's her great aunt. Stephen Heyman, who's working on a lost generation writer and organic farmer named Louis Bromfield. Samanth Subramanian, who's working on scientist J.B.S. Haldane. And Jennifer Homans, who's working on a biography of George Balanchine. We also received a grant this fall from the Sloan Foundation to support a 5th residency fellowship, also of $72,000, for a biography of a figure in science and or technology, and you should please spread the word about that. This is brand new. So if you know of anyone writing on Elon Musk, for instance, that would qualify. We also just received final approval for a master's in biography and memoir from the state of New York.
Bravo.
Yay.
We're all happy.
Marianne knows what that means in terms of forms and bureaucracy, and so we're very happy. That's going to start in the fall, so we have our first incoming class: biographers, historians, literary biographers, memoirists. If you're writing a family memoir and you want some place to focus, this might be a good degree to apply for. We'll have advertising about that soon. So tonight, I'm really thrilled to introduce a couple of scholars and writers who are going to talk about John Ashbery, one of the great poets of the United States. And I'm just coming off a panel about a Chilean poet, the Chilean poet, Pablo Neruda, at the Miami Book Fair, and I'd be interested to hear you say something about the difference in terms of how where poetry stands in Chile as versus where it stands in the United States. I mean, John Ashbery being a relatively obscure figure, but Neruda being like Bruce Springsteen or something in Chile.
Better.
Better, bigger. Karin Roffman, author of this wonderful biography of Ashbery's early years, which is the focus of tonight's event, has published essays on other 20th and 21st century writers and artists in such leading journals as Raritan, Modern Fiction Studies, Art Forum, Rain Taxi, Yale Review, and other places. Her first book from the Modernist Annex, American Women Writers in Museums and Libraries, that came out in 2010, won the University of Alabama Press's American Literature Elizabeth Agee Manuscript Prize and subsequent publication. With her tonight in conversation is the legendary and prolific and influential scholar Marianne Caws, biographer and translator, as well as a writer of her own. She is now Distinguished Professor Emerita here at CUNY Grad Center. She's the author of many books on the relationship between literature and art. She's the editor of Manifesto, A Century of Isms, from Nebraska, and came out in 2001. She's also the author of a number of biographies herself: Henry James, Virginia Woolf, Marcel Proust. So you are very much in the right place here. And speaking of that, I thought I'd get a question off my chest, which is, given that you're both academics and literary scholars, what is it about the biography as a form that tempts you away from a literary critical study? Why biography over a literary critical study?
Together.
Pardon me?
Together.
Together. Do them together, I see. Okay. But still, it's called a biography, what you've written, right? Anyway, please welcome Marianne Caws and Karin Roffman.
So, well, let me leap in with a question. It stops when he goes to France. And my question, of course, is everybody's question is, are you going to do a second volume? Or then why does it stop here? That kind of excursion into your brain.
So yes, I'm writing, but it's not going to be a second volume, it's going to be just one volume.
Oh, wonderful.
And the reason that it stops where it stops, I mean, I had an idea of wanting to write a book that focused on his childhood, about which there was very little written, and about which it's so much in the poetry, the world of childhood. And I knew that he had said no to other biographers, and so I also thought that he might be more willing to let me write a biography if it stopped, and it was just on the early years. And so I waited actually to ask him if I could write the rest until he read the manuscript when I turned it in.
Thank you, because that, I think, is everybody's question. And to me, it's particularly exciting because when, as many of you know, and as Karin has so wonderfully written, when he learned French in order to translate Roussel, last year we celebrated the Roussel Center here, and, well, the year before last, and we gave John the medal, the Roussel medal that you'll see a picture of, which is sort of interesting in its own way. But I'm interested because Motherwell learned French to work on De la Croix, and I love the idea that here these great, painter, poet, people who are doing France because of that. So when did you first like John's poetry, or how did you start?
I started really, in a way, in 2002, there was the 50th anniversary of the Bollingen Prize winners at Yale, and I was a graduate student then, and I went to the event, and I had never heard John read before, and it was overwhelming. I actually, with no disrespect to any of the other winners, it was as though he was the only reader, and it just changed my relationship to his poetry. I mean, I think a lot of people have said that hearing him read changes their relationship to his poetry, and I think he's resisted that a little bit, feels that you should read it on the page, but I can't undo that experience, which was deep for me, that feeling.
But you'd read it first and then heard it. Be interesting to see if somebody heard it and then flipped over it and then went back to the printed page. I mean, I'm fascinated by the difference between the oral, and not the difference, but the, when they get together, the oral and the printed. And I think he was very aware of that, and that's one of the things that interests me about him and art and poetry and life and all of that. I knew him, I guess, first as an art critic, and then as a person and so forth. But I think that the painting and the poetry and the writing I think it all melded wonderfully in him, as it has not in many people. Sometimes the printed and though Marjorie Perloff has an article in the Raritan that I have not yet read about T.S. Eliot's oral fascination. So that's something I haven't gotten to, but I look forward to getting to things.
No, but I think you're totally right. I mean, it's interesting. His art criticism has a kind of genial quality, and I was reading a letter from Peter Sheldal to somebody a long time ago, maybe I think it's the letter's in '65, and he says, "I just love John's art criticism. It's so simple." And so kind. It's a phrase like that, and I think that was a very true comment about his art criticism, that there's something enormously congenial about it. He wants you to look with him, and he's not really criticizing so much as describing what he's seeing, and usually describing what he's seeing in a mostly positive way, even when he's somewhat critical. And so that's one John on the page, and then the poetry, I think, is more difficult on the page. But it's really interesting because on Pen Sound, there's so many recordings of John reading poetry from starting with the very earliest recording at the Y from 52 all the way to 2017, shortly before he died. And you know, his voice changed so much, and his accent, which was a really strong upstate New York, he called the upstate New York and the Midwest accent really similar. And there's a kind of flatness, nasal accent, which is so strong in 52 and becomes less and less as you go along. And so I think also listening to all those recordings is also enormously helpful. One of the ones that I love the most is his earliest recording of The Skaters, which is a great poem from Rivers and Mountains. And he reads it, 1964 was the first recording, and he reads it so fast. And it's not the way, the lines are really, really long, so it's not the way I read it on the page at all. It's very paced when I read it. And his pacing became much slower as he read it over time, but that 64 reading is speedy, and the audience is cracking up. And so all these lines that read on the page, I think, much more seriously and pensively, are with a quick reading and like that intonation and ends of lines happening really quickly, with the laughter following. It really is a totally different experience of that poem.
Yeah, I love the way he gets you to see, and I actually wrote down from somebody's criticism, this is the dazzling single knowledge we get from first things we see in life, things we look at daily and come to know through long, silent experience. That's in his preface to some writings of Cornell I did. But I love the fact that everybody writing about him writes differently. If you look at criticisms of John Ashbery, they're as different as his various moods were, and I love that. I mean, the people who knew him in one way write one way, and people who knew him another way write another way. I wanted to read how good, I love it. This is from him. How good not to have invented his comeliness. It's what we wanted. And I love the way he writes all the time with these exclamations. The enthusiasm of John's writing is what got to me first. The way that he's never boring. It may be expansive. It may go beyond what you think it's going to go. It's always going somewhere else. But the one I wanted to read from Howard Walmsley it's about rivers and mountains, so, what we're talking about. A vast, wide-ranging, poignant, beautifully modulated, irrepressibly comic occasion that demonstrates how the man has found his range and hit his stride. And I think it's so wonderful, the comic, because I knew him as very funny. I mean, when he would talk about Dante, we had publication problems, like together the same kind that we had when I was writing on Convex and publishing his translations and stuff. He would say, it's exactly like hell. And I agree with him. I mean, to meet that committee that I will spare you the details of was so incredibly funny if it was not dreadful. And John could be very, very funny. And I love the funniness of it. Mm-hmm. I mean, here's this genius. I actually think he was a genius. I mean, he was a genius. He was a poetic genius. And he was just as funny as geniuses are usually not. I mean, not the ones I've known are not very funny. But he was funny. And I love that.
No, he was extremely funny and quick. He would come up with the absolute other way of looking at something that you wouldn't expect that would be, I mean, all through. It's something that people remarked on always, even his mother when he was little.
Even his mother, right. I wanted, since we're a biography group here, all of us interested in biography, to say two things that fascinated me about your writing here, because when we write biographies and we don't know what happened, and so I wanted to read, this is from, it's from a program, I will tell you what it was. It was about his listening to John Cage and the music of chance. And so what do you do when you don't know what in the hell happened? You have to, as a biography, bring it in. You want people to know, but you don't know the actual fact. And I thought Karin brilliantly put it in, and this is one of the ways you can do that. if there had been a program that night, we don't know. There was or there wasn't. If there had been a program that night, John Ashbery would have read that Cage was inspired by the I Ching, the philosophy of accident and luck. And I think to sneak in the information that the audience has to have about his reading the I Ching and about how he put, John Cage was I Ching, of course, the way that you got it in, I thought was brilliant. And also I thought that the way that you had these different ways of saying accidents, chance, aleatory, that you had all these different ways of talking about the same thing. And I thought that was one of the greatest biographical tricks.
Oh, that's very kind. Thank you.
It's a trick.
Yeah,
A good trick.
I didn't think about it that way, but I mean, that moment in the biography is sort of, it's one of the most well-known moments of people who follow John's work, was that he had writer's block for a long time and that he got out of it. And the way he got out of it, the specific night he got out of it, was when he went to hear David Tudor perform John Cage it was part of the Living Theater, and it was, I think, January 1st, 1950, and he was there with Frank O'Hara, although one of the other people that I interviewed also claimed to have been with him that night and not Frank O'Hara, but I think it was Frank O'Hara, and he listened, and out of that he started to be able to write again. And so I was really fascinated by that. I mean, music is so important to him, was always so important to him, and the things that he listened to, I mean, he did listen to the German tradition, Beethoven, Brahms, but the things that he listened to even more than that are the most eclectic, extremely contemporary pieces. And I listened to the Cage over and over and over again, and I was thinking about, well, what did it do? I mean, what happened? What was the thinking process that happened? And I mean, when I said that he's quick, his thinking process is so fast that he often doesn't go through the steps that other people go through in sort of figuring out how one thought leads to another. So anyway, there is something in many, many poems, and it's especially present in poems like A Wave, or poems like Flowchart, which are longer poems that sort of move around thought, and the thing is a kind of hum, a sound, and that's what I concluded that he heard, and that hum, that sound, is something that he heard as a child. He lived in a farmhouse, but his grandparents, after they moved out of Rochester, moved to their summer house as their permanent house, which was just 6 miles away from the farmhouse, but it was like another world. It still is like another world. It's the most unbelievably beautiful village on Lake Ontario that you can't imagine. The first time I went up there, I couldn't believe that it still, I mean, and it exists just as it did. It's so beautiful, and that the house that his grandparents had, which is just a small house, was right on the lake. And his window in that house, where he preferred to stay, he preferred it to his parents' house and the farmhouse, had an open window onto the lake, and he listened to that hum, the hum of the lake. And I think that hum, you hear it over and over and over again in his poetry, and I think that you hear it in the Cage piece.
Yeah, and that's interesting because he was a great translator. I don't need to tell you that John Ashbery was one of the greatest translators ever, especially of French poetry, especially of Reverdy, the prose and also the poetry, so I got to use a lot of it, and I just think it was incredible. And Rimbaud, his translations. And I think what Karin is saying there about that hum reminds me of the ostinato, the sort of sostenuto thing that he was, he's very close to music. So, of course, so when he heard that, it seems to me that's like that hum. The thing that gets you from one element that seems not to be the same as the next element, somehow he was able to do it that way, even in the late poetry that sometimes skips all over and my students go, oh my God. But you can hear him thinking. I feel very strongly about that sostenuto, that ostinato thing going on. And I was trying to think about his translations and why they work. And I can't tell you, if you've read them, you will know why they work. They work because they are poets' translations. They are not the rest of us. I translate too, but that's different. John Ashbery's translations, you hear him in the translation. You hear that personal thing that we have a lot of problem, do we want to put ourselves in our translations? John didn't need to ask the question, he's there. I can tell you a mile away who translated X, Y, or Z, which is something that is fascinating. And maybe when we look at those, oh, I want to say one more thing. This is really important to me. I got so excited reading your biography that I was thinking it was very much, the process of it was like a biography of a biography. You know, how it is that you do the process of the writing itself as the biography of your writing. And somehow it seemed to me to work very well there. And I was thinking of, you know, Simmons writing on the quest for Baron Corvo, this really crazy guy called Frederick Rolfe, so interesting. But the way that you write a biography about writing that biography is to us all, one of the most interesting things that can be. And I found that very, very clearly exciting, like the ah moment, you know, when John is saying ah, and, you know, and I love that enthusiasm.
Yeah, the Corvo is interesting. That was one of his favorite biographies.
Yes, mine too.
It's a
And
very
if you
strange
haven't read
book.
that, you will love it. It's about not Baron Corvo. I mean, that's a fake, of course. It's all fake. If you like fake news, you're going to love Frederick Rolfe, who sort of was the Pope, though of course he wasn't, and people had all these, you know, celebrations of various banquets at which he presided, but what's so interesting. And that was the kind of thing that John loved to do a kind of research into this fake excitement. I mean, the excitement's not fake. The fake of the fake is what's exciting, the process of faking it.
Yeah, I mean, I think he was very drawn to anything that remained secret.
Mm-hmm.
And
Like Roussel.
Like Roussel, like Corvo. I mean, he remained secret throughout that biography.
And I think it's great you can write the biography of John, who also loved his secrecy. The whole issue of the creativity done in private, and that whole.
No, it's
very good biography.
Thank you. No, it's true, and it was I mean, my feeling through the whole process of writing was that at any time, if it didn't work out, it was still had been so interesting to me that it was fine. So, so I was open to the possibility that it wouldn't. I didn't have a contract with him. I just had his agreement that we could go through this process together, and he sat for many interviews and was unbelievably open with me. But I was also doing a ton of research simultaneously, and I think that part of the way the experience of the biography developed was that I would bring things to him that he didn't know about his own life, and that was surprising to him, and was also, he had given a lot of interviews, and the interviews usually ended up in the similar path of talking, and the fact that I was doing a lot of original research and finding these things out meant that he couldn't be in those paths because I was telling him new things. So, but I think he also really enjoyed it because he was learning things about his life, and I think part of the reason that he was willing to embark on this interview process was because it enabled him to learn more about his own life than, I mean, even from himself, than he did before, and he was interested in it, even though he said he would never write a memoir, ever. I think he genuinely needed his own life as a provocation for his poetry, and at various points in his life, various things provoked that process. And at this point in his life, when he wasn't that mobile anymore, the fact that I could go off and do this kind of thing and come back and talk to him was also a provocation for him. It served a kind of similar purpose, I think.
And what a compliment that he did it with you. I mean, that to me is a major compliment.
Yes, I mean,
Deserved, but
it was,
a compliment.
well, it was, no, I mean, I think he was worried at times about what was going to happen
Yes.
with things. And we had a system, or I created a system, I should say, that I still use with all my interviews, which is that if somebody tells me something that they're not sure whether they want to have in a book, I put a bracket around it. It's a very simple system. And therefore, in all my notebooks, I have these brackets, and it means that if I put that in, that's what I'm going to ask them to look at before I publish the book. So it's the system I created with him, and in the end, there were brackets, but in the end, he didn't mind if they were in. But I knew what they were because I had bracketed them in my notebook.
That's part of this process that's so interesting when any of us are writing biographies, the process of our process of writing. And so that is, I'm just so glad you told us that.
Yeah, I mean, I think, I'm curious. I know I see Justin, Nathan. I see many biographers here that I know, and I'm sure there are ones here that I know that I don't know that I know. But everybody's process is a little bit different. But if you're dealing with somebody who's alive or interviews with people, I feel that there's, I think, because we have a double desire, right, to be known and to not be known, and so I want to respect that. It's just a book, So we go through the process.
And when we're looking at the pictures, maybe let me say that the picture of John up there, that's the picture I hate the worst. Of all the pictures of John that I've seen, this is a smirk. I really loathe that picture. And we have at the end a picture I really love, him reading. To me, that's not the way he was. I mean, I know everybody has parts of everybody which are different, but to me, that's the most loathsome picture. It's a kind of, it's not the way he was.
Well, that's
I think.
I mean,
I never saw him smirk.
I think that I love how handsome he looks. And I think it's also in the cherry trees. His father took this picture. He hated the cherry trees.
And yet, see?
Cherry trees were work.
Yeah.
So I
see?
think that there's a doubleness of what's going on in that picture.
Okay, we'll see other pictures.
You want to see other pictures?
I want you to see the Roussel picture. It's not a picture of Roussel, not to worry. We could do that, but we're not going to do that. But these are Karin's pictures, and then I snuck in 2 or 3. I love that.
There are a lot of pictures, photographs in the book, and it was one of the pleasures of putting the book together was to choose the pictures and discuss them with him also, but also find photographs from various friends that he had that contributed some of these photographs. So this is the orchard at the farmhouse. And so he hated the orchard at the farmhouse, but it was also a real source of, it was a source of poetry for him. You see it very much in the poem A Wave, where you just see him looking out the window of the orchard of his childhood and seeing the trees.
And of that picture, he said, "Big, lazy horse that I am."
Here's a child, John as a 3-year-old, among the trees in the farmhouse. his parents holding him as a baby. This is his grandparents' house in Rochester, which he loved, and the house that he ended up buying in Hudson was a kind of version of this house. I mean, he was open about the fact that it was a kind of a bigger version of this house. Also, this house was built in the late 1890s in Rochester. His grandparents were the first people to live in it. And the house that he ended up living in Hudson was just built in 1894-95. It was almost it was the same era, very similar. Back and front staircases, very similar. American Victorian style. These are his grandparents. His grandfather was a physicist, the chair of the physics department at University of Rochester, and got to that position through unbelievable amounts of self-education and drive. It's kind of extraordinary what he learned and how much he knew. And I think John felt closest to his grandfather, and his grandfather certainly felt like he understood John. This is you can't quite see how beautiful the lake is, but this is the lake I was mentioning, the Lake Ontario. There he is as, I think, about a...
I love the shadow there.
Yes, that's wonderful. So here's the earliest poem that's in Some Trees. His first book is The Painter, and this is his manuscript draft of it. He wrote it in between his junior and senior year at Harvard while he was home on Lake Ontario every day, looking at the sea. Do you want to hear him read it, or do you want to read it? Yeah?
Yeah.
The Painter. This is Sestina. Sitting between the sea and the buildings, he enjoyed painting the sea's portrait. But just as children imagine a prayer is merely silence, he expected his subject to rush up the sand and, seizing a brush, plaster its own portrait on the canvas. So there was never any paint on his canvas until the people who lived in the buildings put him to work. Try using the brush as a means to an end. Select for a portrait something less angry and large and more subject to a painter's moods, or perhaps to a prayer. How could he explain to them his prayer that nature, not art, might usurp the canvas? He chose his wife for a new subject, making her vast, like ruined buildings, as if forgetting itself, the portrait had expressed itself without a brush. Slightly encouraged, he dipped his brush in the sea, murmuring a heartfelt prayer. My soul, when I paint this next portrait, let it be you who wrecks the canvas. The news spread like wildfire through the buildings. He had gone back to the sea for his subject. Imagine a painter crucified by his subject. Too exhausted even to lift his brush, he provoked some artists leaning from the buildings to malicious mirth. We haven't a prayer now of putting ourselves on canvas or getting the sea to sit for a portrait. Others declared it a self-portrait. Finally, all indications of a subject began to fade, leaving the canvas perfectly white. He put down the brush. At once a howl that was also a prayer arose from the overcrowded buildings. They tossed him the portrait from the tallest of the buildings, and the sea devoured the canvas and the brush as if his subject had decided to remain a prayer.
Isn't that a great poem? Wow. And that's the self-portrait that we'll get back to.
Did you want me to put it up?
No, I just think it's wonderful, the self-portrait, how the self-portrait comes about, because we're going to end, of course, looking at the self-portrait and convex mirror. And he notes about that in the course that he went to at Harvard in 1948. He writes in his margin Parmigianino. So already the thing is, the idea of the self-portrait, which is how many of us fell in love with John Ashbery even before we knew him. That's what it is. It's sort of everything. I mean, that portrait is everything. But
I mean, and even this poem, he had written a poem a couple years earlier when he was at Deerfield that was a kind of beginning of the process of thinking about a self-portrait. That, I mean, you see in every poem that he wrote, that's a kind of finished poem, and often a poem that he wrote really fast is about 20 poems before it that are working up to it.
going there. Is it Roussel coming up next? Whatever's coming up next, I love it. I love that. I just don't love that first picture. I love it. There we are, of course.
Harvard. I'll skip this. This is Some Trees, which is what the title poem of Some Trees. This is a poem he wrote in an hour. I interviewed his roommate, who unfortunately died just a few months after John did in 2017. But this was a wonderful, spectacular roommate and lifelong friend, Bob Hunter, and they shared a room at the time, and they had their chairs sort of back to back in the room. They were making collages and writing poems, and he remembers John sitting down and then saying, "You want to read this?" And that was this, and there's only just one word that he ended up changing after. These are the collages that they were making together that year. The first two actually are just John's collages, but when I say they were making them, they were each making collages separately at their desks that were back to back. And then that's a collage that he made with another friend and became the Harvard Advocate cover. And the interesting thing, or to me the most interesting thing about this collage is this image, which is a Holbein painting that was a wedding present to his parents and hung in the living room. It was in a house of very little art. It was one of the only pieces of art in the house. And John painted it in 1939 when he was taking art classes as a gift. It was a gift for his mother. He painted a version of it, and then it appears again in the Advocate. And there's been a lot of collage shows of his lately, but images work like that. Like you see them popping up again and again that have these long, long histories. This was your...
I just thought, I love it when he exclaims, "What fun." That's the comic thing, and it's also seriously comic. It's the joy that he had. I know there's this feeling of melancholy, which, you bring up and which one sensed in him. However, or also the other side of it, was that he was joyously able to share his enthusiasm with you all the time. So that's why I like this.
Graduating. And then now we're in New York.
That's a really good picture. I think that's the John
that you know?
I knew very well.
Meditate.
That's Meditations of a
We
Parrot.
could hear it. Is it?
Want to hear it?
It's, yeah. Ugh.
Again, there was only one word that he changed. He changed the word paraphrase to the word bed. We can discuss how that is.
Meditations of a Parrot. Oh, the rocks and the thimble, the oasis and the paraphrase, oh, the jacket and the roses. All sweetly stood up the sea to me, like blue cornflakes in a white bowl. The girl said, "Watch this." "I come from Spain," I said. "I was purchased at a fair." She said, "None of us know. There was a house once of dazzling canopies and halls like a keyboard. These the waves tore in pieces. his old wound, and all day, Robin Hood, Robin Hood.
I was going to ask you why Robin Hood.
Why Robin Hood? Well, I've had a few thoughts about why Robin Hood, Robin Hood. I mean, it was certainly a game that they played as kids, and there's a lot of images in this poem from the sea and from a parrot that was there was a parrot that his father gave his aunt that was became the door knocker of the Dartmouth house, and then he moved to the Pulteneyville house, and then he moved to the Hudson house after his mother died, and was also the parrot connects, I think, to his love of Joseph Cornell.
Right.
And the aviary boxes that he saw in '49, right before he wrote this poem. So I think there are a lot of those images, and I think Robin Hood is one of them.
Okay, thank you. And then the Cornell.
And then the Cornell, which is your
He did the preface of this, and the thing I just read you, and I'll read you again because he goes out to see Cornell and so forth, and he loved the way that Cornell had the magic of childhood and the magic of keeping everything, and I love doing the diaries of Cornell, and I guess that's one of the ways I first knew John. But anyway, he said, and that's what I read you before, this is about Cornell, the dazzling single knowledge we get from the first things we see in life, things we look at daily and come to know through long, silent experience. And, Cornell stayed out there on Utopia Parkway, and he didn't go to see a lot of people. I loved the fact that John, talking about him, kept that kind of privacy. And when he said, in the Cornell boxes, many of them are turned to the wall, that's the way it should have been. That privacy was important. And I tried to keep that privacy in Joseph Cornell. I will just tell you, if anybody hasn't read this book now out of print that I love doing, but I had to get permission from the Christian Science people in Boston in order to be able to publish the letters of Joseph Cornell to his mother and to his brother, because they were both dead. We don't say the word dead, but they were elsewhere. And so I had to get permission to be able to publish them, which the whole privacy peculiarity thing appealed, I think, to John as it does to me. So if we see the Roussel, I'll tell you about, is that the next one? Or you want to say anything about Cornell?
Well,
He loved Cornell. Me too.
He loved Cornell. I love your book, and the preface that he gave to that book, I think, is just marvelous. And I mean, I think what you're suggesting about that he appreciated the privacy of Cornell is crucial. I mean, I think it's part of the secrets that he actually needed people to have and to keep certain kinds of secrets in order for the sense of artistic mystery to last. And he was truly worried going to visit Cornell that was going to be undone, and therefore the magic of his relationship to the boxes would be undone as well. And one of the great things about that essay is how he manages to actually reveal quite a lot about Cornell at the same time as suggesting that Cornell's very correctness and some of the correct and strange things he did, like what kind of cookie he liked to eat.
Dreadfully heavy. Clunk. I mean, dreadful.
Like actually enabled him, John Ashbery, to keep that sense of unknowingness alive.
That's great. I should also tell you, oh, hot doggy. Okay, but let me just tell you that when Robert Motherwell, who was close to Cornell also, would go, or they would be together, and Cornell would have these hard candies, and if you took the last candy, woe is you. He really loved hard candy and heavy pastry and all of that. Cornell's obsession with having the sweet things and having the last one. So, if you dared, even Robert Motherwell, who dared a lot, but not to take the last candy. He knew better. So I'm so glad Karin brought this up. This, of course, is everybody's favorite way of knowing John's self-portrait in a convex mirror first. And as I said, in 1948 at Harvard, he had written Parmigianino alongside the notes he was taking. And when I looked at this painting first, what fascinates me is you don't know whether that hand is letting you in or keeping you out. So as you say, this kind of ambiguity, this sort of oxymoron thing, is it taking you in or is it letting you out? I think that's what fascinated John, and that's certainly the most wonderful epic poem ever, in my not very humble opinion. I'm sure it is the greatest poem ever.
I mean, and one of the funny things I think about him is that, it is a wonderful poem, and he always was quite resistant to the fact that people found it a way into his work, and would say that he wrote other poems that he liked better. But in 2016, one of the collages that he made was he made several collages that used the self-portrait image, but he made one that has another hand coming out with grapes, and it's very funny. I mean, it's part of, I think, his sense of not stopping the process of thinking, so that something doesn't become a kind of monument to his work, but becomes part of the long process by which he continues to think about it. I mean, in terms of the early book, Some Trees, one of the things that I really loved was to track, after Some Trees was published, which poems he said he liked best, and which poems he liked worst, which changed from year to year. So there was no sort of set version of even that book that he ever decided were the best poems from that book.
That's perfectly put, because he had so little of the static about him. He was just not static. He was always in motion, like the I Ching and the chants. And so I'm so glad you brought that out, because that is absolutely right. That's the sort of elusive quality, and that hand that gets you in or takes you out. All of those things about John are part of the very big reason for which we remain attached to him. So I want to see the Roussel, if we can. And then I know we have to stop because we're excited about questions and answers because there are all these biographers.
This is the Fairfield Porter. Justin Spring wrote a biography of Fairfield Porter, so I'm sure he knows this one very well. Pantoum, I won't play it, but it has this wonderful image of clay pipes, and one of the wonderful discoveries that was a poem that was quite mysterious to me, but it was through Cornell who puts clay pipes as in some of the boxes, and clay pipes were also one of the ways to make soap bubbles, and so that strange image, which is completely decontextualized from any of those things, does connect, I think, in very specific ways to these other interests. This is in 1954, shortly before the book that I wrote ends. He had a long period of depression that year. He had left his job, he had gotten fired and didn't have a job, and was visiting his friend Jane Freilicher almost every day. And this is a lost painting, actually, but it shows his dark mood that year, and it just preceded the amazing things that happened in '55 by chance in certain ways, but also by a long series of a lot of work, which was that he won a Fulbright and won the Yale Younger Press Prize at basically in the same week, and really it changed his life. So this is the Roussel.
Let me just say that this is John kept this very carefully, and he was given a medal, and I had to go talk, so I was extremely excited. This is the thing that's a croissant that stays from the whole meeting, the whole breakfast that Raymond Roussel, the world's most peculiar, wonderful person, most dandy, like John was in some phases of his life. The thing that he kept was this, Raymond Roussel, the weird and wonderful person, for whom John learned French in order to translate him. This is a croissant in the form of a star that Raymond Roussel kept because of Flammarion's breakfast at which it was. And when the Roussel Society gave this medal to John, and I wish he could have come, it was 2 years ago, and he couldn't come, but he was going to come. And so we got to award him this medal from the Raymond Roussel Society in Barcelona. And what he did was, that is, this is John writing on Roussel, the complete deodorization and objectification of the language. Because if you've read Roussel, it's totally incomprehensible, but that's the point partly. It starts with one word and then, it's so weird and so wonderful. And John loved it for those weird and wonderful things that were also part of his personality. So I'm so glad to be able to show it to you. We did award it to him. To John.
Yeah.
Hi, thanks a lot. I've two questions. One is whether you can say more about what you heard in the Bollingen reading, and also what the word in some trees is that he changed.
Oh, in some trees, he changed errors to accents in the last line. And in the Bollingen reading, I've been meaning to go back actually and listen to it because it's actually available at Yale, but I'm also afraid to. So I don't know what he read. I don't remember what he read. I do remember that I was unbelievably far from the stage because of how crowded it was, and but somehow, and my eyes aren't that great, but somehow I felt like I saw him. So, but I don't know. Sometimes I think he read at North Farm, but I think that may be just because of that opening image, is the zooming, and that's just actually how it felt to me.
I was actually just trying to ask what about the way you read changed things for you.
I think that it may be the pace, but I'm not sure. I mean, it was also just that it made what he read not abstract in any way. Although I don't mean that in the sense that it became a kind of realistic or literal thing. I just mean that it became precise.
Did you have anxiety about figuring out too much in the way that he felt about Cornell, that you were going to lose your love for the poetry if you knew too much as a biographer?
No. I mean, for all you biographers, tell me what you think, but for me, the process of learning is a process of learning as much as possible so that you can get to the point of learning. So I don't think so. And it was also helpful for me to know that when he was trying to learn about Roussel, the first thing he did was try to learn about him biographically. Like, there was nothing about Roussel in 50, I mean, Michael Lyrus had written a lot, and he went to interview him in France, but he didn't have access to much information, and he basically traced the steps, Roussel's steps in France. That's what he went to do. And so regardless of his own sort of skepticism and resistance to biography, I knew for sure that he had the same impulse. So I went with that.
And he was obsessive. I love obsessions. And he was truly obsessive. John was, and Roussel was, major, what? So obsessiveness appeals to the obsessive, you know, and I wanted to do a book on obsession, but obviously everything is going to be in the book, so why would you do that book? Why would you be a biographer if you weren't obsessed with the person you were writing about? I mean, I was writing about Proust. I couldn't read anything else for the, you know, I wrote on Dali. I hate Dali's paintings. I love the way he wrote, so I was obsessed for I don't know how many years with his writing. You don't have to be obsessed by the whole person, but by at least one part of the person. And John's obsession with Roussel and this particular star, which links back to Cornell, of course, and all that kind of thing, is so interesting to me. The obsession with one detail can make a whole life.
I mean, one of his, oh, sorry, go ahead.
This very nuts and bolts, but you referred to the bracketing of elements and to his reading it, and I'm wondering what your agreement was. Was he going to be able to read and approve the manuscript, or?
We didn't have an agreement, and it was, so it was just, we just progressed by feel. So I feel about writing biography that you're given especially about somebody alive, that you're given an opportunity, but also it's treacherous. I mean, it's another person's life is theirs, and so I respected the brackets but also respected the process of writing a biography without the influence in some way or interference of the subject. That is, that a biography is not an autobiography, so that it was going to be my take on what I had learned. And I didn't show him the book until I finished it, and he called me once. I was at my son's soccer practice, and he called to say, I really need to see it. Like, it was just out of the blue. And I said, you know, John, it would kill me to show you a manuscript while I was still figuring out how to do it. Because I also had to figure out how to write a biography. I mean, it was my first. So please be patient and just, trust that we'll keep going. And so he was incredibly patient, because we started this process in 2000, officially in 2011, and I gave him the manuscript. He said yes in September of 2011, and I gave him the manuscript in May of 2016. So he was pretty patient.
Thanks so much for this. I also have a sort of process question related to nuts and bolts, which is, could you talk about how you began the project organizationally? So, especially coming from an academic background, right, where arguments, I feel like, often are the driver of the work, right? This monograph is functionally about an argument. And it's not that biographies don't rely on arguments, but that narrative is often at the center. And so I was wondering if you could talk about how you organized, even just where you wanted to start, how you would go about in the process of, I'll do interviews here and research here, archival research here. How will I set that up to speak to one another and drive the writing?
Yeah, there are a lot of people in this room you should query about this question, because I think everybody's process is a little bit different. I'll tell you as quickly as possible my own, which is that I need to get to the end before I can write at the beginning. So it's a problem for me in terms of the fact that I have to do all the research and all the writing, and then I can rewrite it. So basically, I wrote a 500-page book by 2014 and spent 2 years rewriting it into a 200-page book. And I just had to do all that work to get to less. And in terms of the academic narrative thing, it's totally different. And I had to kick the academic out of myself. The academic writer, not the academic that learned how to do research, but the writer and learn how to write narrative. And it's just a process. It's not that easy either. And I think that, yeah, I'm curious, what would you say about that process?
I just have never felt a separation between the academic and the writerly. I don't know what's wrong with me, but I love teaching. I still teach here, you know. I'm retired, but I'm kept on as a resident professor. I teach. And I just think it's so exciting to be able to write and share with the people you're talking with what it is you're doing. So for me, they haven't ever been different. I know it's supposed to be different, academic and writing, but I write personal criticism. So it's never been like academic. I guess that's what it, so that's just the way I happen to be. I start with obsessions, as I said. I start with details, and then maybe I will go and read other people on whoever it is I'm writing on. But everybody I've been in love with, like René Char, the poet, and so forth and so on, they've been right there or dead, but when they're alive, I do their poetry with them. I just have never felt that distinction that people keep telling me about between the academic and the writerly. It just seems to me that I'm just one person doing what I'm obsessed by. And then I share my obsessions. And then my students share what they're doing in their independent study, writing with me. So I have never felt that, but I know people keep saying you're an academic. I don't want to be an academic, I just want to be a writer, you know, and I'm lucky that I do it. But it is interesting. That is, of course, a question that keeps coming up. And I never know why, Karin.
Well, I mean, I think for me, the difference was pace, partly, and also like the amount of time that you can spend discussing a work in an academic essay seemed to me more than I needed for a biography, that I needed to move quicker. So I think I felt like every aspect of academic writing was helpful to me, but that I also had to shift the energy.
Yeah, pace is probably right, yeah.
I just want to say that academic is not such a good adjective. Being in academia a long time, it's obscurity. And sometimes not everything obscure is deep.
Quite right.
Do you have any theories about mental health and mental illness in poetry? I think especially about Jameson's biography of Robert Lowell. Do you feel that a normal and placid mind can produce good or great poetry? That's from the creative side, but from the biographer's side, do you think being preoccupied or focusing on the author's mental health interferes with appreciating the art itself?
Can I leap in about Picasso? Not just Dora Maar. I did the biography of Dora Maar, who was very much involved with Picasso, as we know, and then she went mad, as we know, and all that kind of thing. But what fascinated me I was writing a biography of Picasso, and I put at the end a thing about Jung, because it turns out that somebody was fascinated with the way Jungian psychoanalysis would help would help Picasso. So I put that at the end, and since I've done a lot of translation of Breton and Freud and all that kind of thing, it seemed to me fascinating that somebody could find it so revealing of Picasso, the whole psychoanalytic thing, you know, and this person was a very great Jungian. I mean, Freud for him was nowhere where Picasso was. I mean, it seems to me that's a personal choice too. Which particular theories of psychoanalytic everything you're going to use to apply to the person you're writing on. When Dora Maar went mad, briefly, and she really went mad, she became very religious, and her shrink, who was called Lacan, and you know that Jacques Lacan was Pablo Picasso's doctor. I don't mean his shrink, it was his doctor. And so Lacan said to him, look, Dora Maar, either she has to be in a straitjacket or in the arms of God. So she chose the arms of God. She became a recluse, a religious recluse. So that, in that particular case, that seemed to me that you have to bring up when you're doing that kind of biography. But I don't think it's always necessary. But I was interested in Picasso. Everybody has, everybody's theories. But about Duramar, there was only the Lacanian theory, in the arms of God or in a straitjacket.
Well, I think that for John, he had periods of depression, I think, for his whole life, and the one that I mentioned in 1954, I think, was not a period when he was doing a ton of writing. I think writing actually was quite hard while he was depressed, but it was a period when he was doing a lot of thinking, and that kind of melancholy aspect of his depression, which I think was not terrible depression, but kind of lifelong, was helpful. You hear it in his poetry, but he could manage it. I haven't read the Lowell biography yet, but it's definitely on my list of next biographies to read. So I can't discuss that biography yet with you, though I read about it.
Okay. What was Ashbery's relationship to Rochester? And how did that change?
Well, Rochester was the first city he knew, and he loved it compared to where he was growing up in Sodus, which was about 30 miles away. And that Dartmouth Street house that I showed you was, it's about a block from East Avenue, if you know Rochester, right? So it's and next to a church, and it was actually, at that time, University of Rochester was there. So it was before it moved to the River campus. So it was a kind of very middle class, mostly professors who worked there. And John had an enormous amount of independence there, and he could walk to the Memorial Art Gallery, which was a center for him for years when he was a child of learning art. So I think Rochester was extremely important to him. And then when he was 14, he went to Chicago for the first time, and that was the beginning of sort of moving towards bigger cities. I think the one thing about Rochester that wasn't what he wanted was a kind of, as soon as he started reading Life magazine and started reading about New York City and sort of getting an idea of what kind of an artist's life he might be able to forge in a city like New York, I think Rochester became a smaller city, but before that, it was the biggest city he knew.
You seem to have maintained your affection for your subject. Was there a point where you fell out of love, or am I misreading you? You seem to have come out of this still. Was there a moment where you stopped admiring him or stopped feeling sympathy?
No. And I think that there's certain things that sometimes it's helpful to read what others think about that. Like the Peter Schjeldahl comment about the art criticism was enormously helpful to me, because I didn't have the connection to the art criticism, or I didn't feel about it the way that I felt about the poems. And so his view was actually helpful. I read it differently after I read that letter. But in terms of your sort of general point, I mean, he was a marvelous person to know, and his work is remarkable and meaningful, and there's so much of it, so that one can kind of move around it.
So we have time for one more question, which I'm going to ask. I'll give one more. The consensus among biographers is better to work with someone who's dead. So now you're going to have the opportunity to work with the dead John Ashbery. And do you think that's going to be better because he's no longer there to kind of call you when your son's having a soccer game?
No. I mean, it's challenging to write a biography about somebody alive, but it's also challenging to write about a biography of somebody who's not alive. I mean, genuinely, I miss him, so.
In a sense, it was the question I was going to ask, and you partly approached it just now. You seem, in my understanding, in what you've said, to concentrate more on his writing or on the written word than you do on his art. Now, you wrote an early biography, and his art was mostly manifest in the second half of his life.
You mean his art criticism?
Not his art criticism, his own collage work, which of which he did enormous numbers of artworks, of pieces. And the information that you can pull out of those collages on so many different levels is in many ways quite different from his written material. And it's quite different from the way he approached art criticism as well. And I'm wondering if you could speak a little about how you can reconcile those things. And also because of the hidden nature of the information that comes out in the collage work, and then, you know, the layered work of his later poetry as well.
No, I think you're totally right that there are different sort of registers of information in the poems and in the collages. And I mean, the biography actually began as a project on his Hudson house. He had come to my class, and I was writing about museums and libraries at the time, and he invited me to see his Hudson house, and I started a project about the provenance of all the objects in the house. And the provenance of all the objects in the house were so complex and also so connected to his childhood that, in fact, I had to start going to do research up in upstate New York in order to understand where these objects had come from and what their histories were. Not just their histories with him, but also just their histories. And I think that the house that he created is closest to the collage, and the collages, I mean, one of the amazing things about looking at the collages is picking out the specific objects that you see in the house. And I think that when you then look at the poems from the lens of that, the poems actually start to look a little bit more like the collages than they did before. So I think certainly his art is incredibly important to me, and the two or the three that I showed were happening at the very same time that he started to figure out how to write the kind of poems that would populate the rest of the volumes of his poetry, but I mean specifically Some Trees, but he figured, in The Painter, he figured something out. And the fact that they're happening simultaneously makes sense to me.
Thank you very much. That was terrific.
Thanks. Thank you so much.
Have fun.